Hello and welcome to Pockenrop. It's December 2021 and there's been a fair amount of music journalism over the last year that has considered whether or not 50 years ago, 1971, was the greatest year for the release of the album. Now, I'm jumping on that bandwagon and this video is going to be my top 15 albums from the year 1971. Before I do that, I'll just remind you to like the video, hit the subscribe button and click the bell to receive notifications of future content. In at number 15, I have placed Don McLean's American Pie. I'm not a huge fan of the album. I think it's perfectly pleasant. But what it does have on it is two phenomenal songs that between them take up approximately a third of the album. And they are the title track, the epic American Pie, which is magnificent, and the #1 hit single in the UK, Vincent, about Vincent van Gogh, which again I think is an absolutely wonderful song, both of which warrant the fact that it's just made its place onto this list. I have yet to listen to this album, which is Man in Black by Johnny Cash. I have a feeling that that could quite comfortably push American Pie out of my top 15. But number 15, American Pie by Don McLean. At number 14, I have placed Medal by Pink Floyd. So it's by no means my favourite Pink Floyd album, but the track Echoes is amazing, a whole side of the record. And One of These Days, I think, is one of their best instrumentals. And I enjoy Medal. I don't love it like I do many of the other later Pink Floyd albums, and so it finds its way to number 14. And number 13 is Every Picture Tells a Story by Rod Stewart. This is a fine album. Again, it's just overshadowed, a bit like American Pie is, by a phenomenal song, which is of course Maggie May, his first UK #1 single. That's not to say that stuff like Reason to Believe and Mandolin Wind aren't also great. It's a fine album and it was Rod Stewart's first major success, but I placed it at number 13. And number 12 is an album I placed pretty highly on a recent list that I did. That was the tribute to my dad, which was country music, and it's John Denver's Poems, Prayers and Promises. This has got a beautiful cover of Junk by McCartney, so it automatically gains a little bit more in my affections when you start to cover my favourite artist of all time. There's also a cover of Let It Be. What it also contains is some of his most affecting and greatest songs of his career. Take Me Home Country Roads. We've got Sunshine on My Shoulders, which is going to get me next time I actually listen to it, because that was played at my dad's funeral. And I guess I'd rather be in Colorado. I can live without the cover version of James Taylor's Fire and Rain. I much prefer the original. And then at the end, there's a poem called The Box, all about war. And it's an interesting album. And if you've not listened to Poems, Prayers and Promises, it's worth your time. And it's my number 12. And number 11 is an album I've been keeping an eye out for in the used racks at my local record shop. It is Surf's Up by the Beach Boys. Again, we have an album that is defined by two killer tracks, one of which is the title track and the second of which is Disney Girls. But the music wrapped around the rest of that album is also really good. And it may even lay claim to being my favourite Beach Boys album. And number 10, and sticking with the theme of 60s bands travelling into the 70s, Muswell Hillbillies by the Kinks. Often cited as their last truly great album, and given the rock opera excesses and mistakes of the 70s, I kind of agree. So this contains 20th Century Man, acute schizophrenia, paranoia blues, which is quite hard to say. The best track on here for me is Here Come the People in Grey. The album is a moody battle with mental health that Ray Davies was enduring at the time. It's a really good album, Muswell Hillbillies. And number 9 is an album by a huge selling artist with a huge amount of success, but there's a good chance you've never listened to it. Cold Spring Harbor by Billy Joel, his debut album. So this is kind of an album that Billy Joel himself has disowned a little bit. He reclaimed some of it by playing She's Got Away and Everybody Loves You Now on the Songs from the Attic live album. But there's so much more on here that indicates what a talent Billy Joel was and was going to be in the future. Outside of those two tracks, Nocturne is probably the other standout on here. It's a really fine album that I think is worth exploring. Number 8, Billy Joel's Cold Spring Harbor. And number 8, I have placed Who's Next by The Who. This for me is almost certainly their finest album. And it's an album that was born from the failure of Pete Townsend to try and do a concept album called Lifehouse. The songs on here were not only rehearsed before being recorded, but they were played live to really refine the quality. It kicks off with Baby O'Reilly, or Teenage Wasteland as it's sometimes known. And that's an absolutely outstanding album opener. I love Bargain on here. And I think Behind Blue Eyes is an absolutely tremendous song. And the concluding track, Won't Get Fooled Again, is possibly the very best thing that Who ever did. So at number 8, Who's Next? At number 7, I have placed an album that recently got put at number 1 in the Rolling Stone 500 or 1000 or 2000, whatever number they were currently doing. Greatest album of all time. It is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. Like Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye had been struggling with Motown and managed to get them to allow him a huge amount of creative control. He and Stevie Wonder were the big stars on Motown. And he turned in What's Going On and they didn't like it. But this contains the title track, Mercy Me, the Ecology song, which is a phenomenal song, Holy, Holy, Right On, God Is Love. It's a really good album, actually. And whilst it didn't kind of fly off the shelves initially, it has grown in stature to become one of the greatest albums of all time. What's Going On? Marvin Gaye, number 7. And number 6, I have placed an album whose title track is often cited by people as being the greatest song of all time, although I do not agree at all. It's Imagine by John Lennon. So side 1 gives us Imagine, Crippled Inside, which may well have been a dig at McCartney. The finest thing on here, which is Jealous Guy. It absolutely stands alone, and of course was written in 1968 in Rishikesh. And if you've watched the Get Back documentary, you'll see that they did revisit it again as a possibility for the Let It Be project. It dips a little, I think, with I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. And I'm always uncomfortable when I listen to How Do You Sleep, because it is such a vicious and bloody attack on his former songwriting partner. Imagine is a really good album, though. And as a whole, it stands together as an artistic statement as possibly the best thing that he released. Certainly the most commercial thing that he released as a solo artist. And it's my number 6, Imagine by John Lennon. Into my top 5 now. And when I did my 1970s top 15 albums, 4 of the albums in this top 5 were contained within that list of 15. So maybe I agree it's the greatest year for albums. This is the only one that wasn't, and is the only album on this list from 1971 that could potentially have snuck in on a different day. It's Madman Across the Water. This was probably my number 16, actually, in my 1970s list. I think this album is phenomenal. I really do. And although it's a spoiler, at some point I will be doing my top 15 Elton John albums, and boy, there's a lot of Elton John albums to consider. Madman Across the Water is a strong contender for that number 1 spot. Tiny Dancer alone warrants a high position on the list, but Leave On is fantastic. Razorface is great. The title track, Madman Across the Water, is one of my all-time favourite songs. Holiday Inn is superb. It ends beautifully with Goodbye. Then we've got All the Nasties, that gospel-inflected song. It's a terrific album, Madman Across the Water. And number 5 could have potentially made it into my overall 70s list, but it's wonderful. Madman Across the Water, we are now into some serious quality. My number 5. And all of the rest of the top four are, if you've seen my 1970s list, they're in exactly the same order that they appeared in that list. At number 4, Tapestry by Carole King. At one time, the biggest selling album in the world. Peerless singer-songwriting. I Feel the Earth Move, It's Too Late, So Far Away, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, You've Got a Friend, of course, which is also released in 1971 on Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon by James Taylor and was a massive hit from that. Number 4, Tapestry by Carole King. At number 3 is an album that I've listened to for well over 30 years. It's Ram by Paul and Linda McCartney. This is my half-speed master edition that I got in the summer. Ram is an album that is now pretty widely and universally acclaimed as an amazing album. At the time, it was critically slammed. It was successful. It hit number 1 in the UK, number 2 in the US. At the time, Paul was receiving a huge amount of flack for being the man that had finally broken up the Beatles. But of course, we know that it was a much more complex story than that now. And he was critically mauled over it. His bandmates hated it. There was digs on here to Lennon and Yoko in Too Many People. He's admitted recently in his The Lyrics book that actually that was a diss track. That was a John and Yoko diss track. So the fact that we have got the uncomfortable making How Do You Sleep is as a result of Ram. But John, being the absolute narcissist that he really was, he also thought an awful lot more of this record was about him, like Dear Boy, which wasn't. It was about Linda's first husband. And lines in Backseat of My Car, We Believe We Can't Be Wrong, was about John and Yoko. It wasn't. It was actually about Paul and Linda. And actually, Paul does a lot of that in his songs where he says, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. He does that a lot. But Ram is a great artistic statement. And if you want to know more about what I think of it, you can have a look at my Ram ranking video where I ranked every single one of the tracks on here. And I do make the point that not one of them's bad. So Ram is at number 3. At number 2, Led Zeppelin 4, or Four Symbols, or Zoso, or Styx, or whatever you choose to call it. This is actually officially untitled. It's just known as Led Zepp 4. One of the greatest rock albums ever. It contains Stairway to Heaven. It contains Black Dog and Rock and Roll and Battle for Evermore. And it's 8 tracks of brilliance. Led Zeppelin 4, my number 2. At number 1, originally number 3 on my 1970s list, but I make the point that actually that top 3 could interchange at any moment. Hunky Dory. This is, in my view, the best album of 1971. And again, this was not a commercial success at the time. But what an album. Changes, Oh You Pretty Things, and Life on Mars are absolutely fantastic. We've then also got Bewlay Brothers and Queen Bitch and Andy Warhol and Song for Dylan. It's a terrific album. And then right in the middle is one of my all-time favourite Bowie tracks, which is Kooks. I think Hunky Dory is, again, this could be a spoiler, but I do think it is David Bowie's finest record. I adore Hunky Dory, and it's my number 1 album of 1971. So that concludes my top 15 of the year 1971. Is it the best year of music ever? I'll leave you to decide that. I'll just remind you to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell to receive notifications. We're getting to the end of 2021, and that means that in the next 2 Saturdays, I will be covering 2 things. One will be the Pockenrop Awards, where I am going to give out my own tongue-in-cheek awards for the year 2021. And the other will be my top 15 albums of 2021. So join me again over the next 2 Saturdays to watch those videos. But until then, thanks for watching.